Most people spend their lives trying to be understood by others, explaining their pain, their choices, their mistakes, and their dreams again and again, hoping that someone will finally validate their existence. They speak not because they want to share, but because they fear being misunderstood, judged, or left behind. Buddhism teaches a very different path, one that does not rely on constant explanation or external approval. True peace does not come from being understood by the world, but from understanding yourself so deeply that explanations become unnecessary. When you stop explaining yourself, your mind becomes lighter, your energy becomes calmer, and your life begins to move forward without resistance. Silence becomes your protection, stillness becomes your strength, and your growth begins quietly, away from noise, opinions, and unnecessary attention. These 7 Buddhist lessons reveal why the wisest way to live is to build yourself quietly and reveal nothing. 1. Explaining yourself binds you to other people's minds. Buddhism teaches that much of our suffering does not come from what happens to us, but from what we attach ourselves to mentally, and one of the most hidden yet powerful attachments is the desire to be understood by others. From a young age, we are taught to explain ourselves, to justify our choices, and to defend our intentions so that people will see us in a good light. Over time, this habit becomes so automatic that we do not realize how deeply it controls our inner peace. Each time you explain yourself, you are quietly placing your emotional well-being into someone else's hands, waiting for their response to decide how you should feel about yourself. When people agree with you, you feel calm and validated. But when they misunderstand you, question your motives, or judge your decisions, discomfort arises in the heart. This emotional movement is not created by their words alone, but by your attachment to their perception. The Buddha taught that people do not see the world as it truly is, but through the lens of their own experiences, fears, expectations, ego, and unresolved pain. This means that no matter how honest, gentle, or clear your explanation is, it will always be filtered through another person's inner world, which you cannot control. Many people suffer because they believe that if they just explain themselves better, they will finally be understood, accepted, or respected. But Buddhism reminds us that understanding cannot be forced. Some people are not listening to understand you, but to protect their own beliefs, defend their ego, or confirm the story they have already created about you in their mind. In such cases, explanation becomes a trap, because the more you speak, the more you become entangled in their opinions and judgments. When you stop explaining yourself, something powerful begins to happen inside. You no longer wait for others to approve your feelings, your choices, or your path. Your mind becomes steadier because it is no longer reacting to every misunderstanding or criticism. You begin to realize that your worth does not depend on being understood, and your peace does not depend on being agreed with. This shift brings a deep sense of freedom because you are no longer living inside other people's minds, but firmly rooted in your own awareness. By releasing the need to explain yourself, you step out of an invisible prison created by attachment to perception. You stop negotiating your value with the world, and you begin to walk your path with quiet confidence. Buddhism teaches that true peace arises when the mind no longer seeks validation from outside, but rests calmly within itself, knowing that not everyone needs to understand you for your life to be meaningful. 2. Silence protects your energy from draining connections. Buddhism teaches that your inner energy is precious, and how you use it determines the quality of your life. Every thought you repeat, every argument you engage in, and every unnecessary explanation you give slowly consumes mental and emotional energy. Many people do not realize that they are not tired because of hard work or responsibility, but because they are constantly explaining themselves to people who do not truly listen or care to understand. When you speak to be understood instead of to express truth, your energy begins to leak in small but continuous ways. Some people listen only to respond, not to understand. Others listen to judge, compare, or gain a sense of control. In such interactions, no amount of explanation brings peace, because the intention on the other side is not clarity, but ego. Buddhism teaches that engaging with such energy creates suffering because you are feeding confusion instead of wisdom. When you repeatedly explain yourself in these situations, your mind becomes restless, your emotions become unstable, and your inner balance slowly weakens. Silence, in this sense, is not withdrawal from life, but protection of what is sacred within you. It is the awareness to recognize when words will heal and when they will only deepen exhaustion. When you choose silence, you stop pouring your energy into conversations that drain you and begin redirecting it inward, where it can nourish clarity, discipline, and inner strength. This redirection allows your mind to settle, your thoughts to slow down, and your emotions to regain balance. Buddhism reminds us that energy follows attention. When your attention is constantly pulled outward through explanations and justifications, your inner world becomes scattered. But when you guard your words and speak only when necessary, your energy gathers instead of dispersing. This gathered energy strengthens your presence, sharpens your awareness, and gives your actions quiet power. People may notice that you speak less, but they will feel that you carry more weight, because your energy is no longer wasted. By choosing silence over unnecessary explanation, you are not avoiding people, but choosing peace over conflict and wisdom over noise. You learn to recognize which connections nourish your spirit and which slowly drain it. Over time, your life becomes lighter, not because problems disappear, but because your energy is no longer consumed by them. Buddhism teaches that when energy is protected, the mind becomes calm, the heart becomes steady, and the path ahead becomes clearer without force or struggle. 3. The lotus does not announce its bloom. Buddhism often uses the lotus flower as a symbol of inner growth and awakening because of the way it rises silently from muddy water into beauty and clarity. The lotus does not explain where it came from, how difficult the mud was, or how long it struggled beneath the surface. It does not ask for permission to bloom, nor does it seek approval for its beauty. It simply grows in silence, and when the time is right, it reveals itself naturally. This teaching holds a powerful lesson for human life, especially in a world where people feel pressured to constantly announce their plans, their progress, and their personal transformation. Many people speak loudly about what they are going to become because they are still unsure inside. Talking becomes a way to seek reassurance, encouragement, or validation before the work has truly been done. Buddhism teaches that true growth does not need witnesses. The deepest changes happen quietly within the mind and heart, where discipline is built, habits are reshaped, and awareness is strengthened. When you constantly explain your goals or struggles, you invite opinions, doubts, and interference that can weaken your focus and disturb your inner balance. Silence allows growth to happen without pressure. When you build yourself quietly, your energy remains directed toward action rather than explanation. Your attention stays rooted in the present moment instead of being scattered by other people's expectations. Just like the lotus, your roots grow deep in unseen places, developing strength and stability long before anything becomes visible on the surface. Buddhism teaches that a strong foundation is created in stillness, not in noise. Over time, this quiet work begins to change you in ways that cannot be hidden. Your presence becomes calmer, your decisions become firmer, and your confidence becomes natural rather than forced. You no longer feel the need to convince others of your worth. because your actions reflect your inner transformation. When results finally appear, they speak clearly without explanation. People may not know your journey, but they will feel its truth. The lotus teaches us that announcing your growth too early can expose fragile roots to unnecessary disturbance. By allowing yourself to grow in silence, you protect the process itself. Buddhism reminds us that patience is wisdom and timing is everything. When the moment is right, your life will bloom naturally, and no words will be required to explain how far you have come. 4. Not everything deserves access to your inner world. Buddhism teaches mindfulness not only in thoughts and actions, but also in what we choose to share and with whom. Many people believe that openness means telling everyone everything, but this often leads to confusion, regret, and emotional exhaustion. Your inner world, which includes your thoughts, emotions, dreams, fears, and plans, is delicate and still forming, and when it is exposed too early or to the wrong people, it can easily be disturbed. Silence, in this sense, is not secrecy or dishonesty, but a form of wisdom that protects what is still growing. Not everyone who listens does so with good intention or understanding. Some people listen in order to judge, some to compare, and some to project their own fears onto your life. When you share your plans with someone who is deeply afraid, their doubt can quietly enter your mind and weaken your confidence. When you share your pain with someone who lacks compassion, their reaction can make you feel smaller instead of supported. Buddhism teaches that suffering often arises not from events themselves, but from careless exposure of our inner state to minds that are not prepared to handle it. By choosing silence, you create a natural boundary around your inner world. This boundary allows you to observe people without confrontation and understand who respects your space and who demands access to it. Those who are patient with your silence, who do not push for explanations, and who do not pressure you to reveal more than you are ready to share, show through their behavior that they are safe. Buddhism reminds us that wisdom is not in reacting, but in observing calmly before engaging. When fewer people have access to your unfinished thoughts and plans, your mind becomes lighter and more focused. You no longer carry the weight of defending your choices or explaining your direction. Your energy stays centered, allowing you to develop clarity and confidence without interference. This inner clarity helps you make better decisions because they come from awareness rather than outside influence. Protecting your inner world also teaches you self-respect. When you value your own thoughts and feelings, you no longer feel the urge to seek constant reassurance. You begin to trust your own judgment and timing. Buddhism teaches that true strength is quiet and does not demand attention. By revealing less, you give yourself the space to grow fully before stepping forward, ensuring that when you do, your actions come from stability rather than vulnerability. 5. Explaining yourself keeps you attached to the past. Buddhism teaches that clinging to the past is one of the most subtle causes of suffering, and constantly explaining yourself is one of the quiet ways this attachment survives. Every time you explain why you made a certain decision, why you changed, or why you are no longer the same person you once were, you are mentally returning to an old version of yourself and reliving moments that no longer exist. The mind begins to move backward instead of forward, carrying emotional weight that should have been released long ago. Many people feel the need to explain themselves because they fear being misunderstood based on who they used to be. They feel pressure to defend old actions, past mistakes, or earlier beliefs, as if they are still required to be accountable for a version of themselves that has already faded. Buddhism reminds us that life is impermanent and that change is not a failure, but a natural law. You are not meant to remain the same, and you are not obligated to make your present self understandable to those who refuse to let go of your past image. When you continue explaining, you keep old stories alive in your mind. These stories replay conversations, regrets, justifications, and emotional reactions that drain your awareness. Instead of living fully in the present moment, your energy is pulled into mental time travel, where peace cannot exist. Buddhism teaches that true freedom comes from releasing attachment to who you were and allowing who you are becoming to unfold naturally, without explanation or defense. Silence creates space for this release. When you stop explaining your past, you stop feeding it. The mind begins to settle because it no longer needs to protect old identities or repair outdated narratives. You begin to accept that growth does not require permission and transformation does not require explanation. This acceptance allows you to move forward lightly without dragging emotional baggage behind you. Many people will struggle with your change, not because it is wrong, but because it challenges their fixed image of you. Buddhism teaches that this discomfort belongs to them, not to you. Their resistance is often rooted in fear of change, not in truth. When you stop explaining yourself, you allow others to process your transformation in their own time, without forcing your evolution to fit their expectations. Letting go of explanations is an act of compassion toward yourself. It allows you to forgive who you were without repeatedly reopening old wounds. It allows your present actions to stand on their own, free from the shadow of past decisions. Buddhism teaches that the present moment is the only place where peace exists, and silence helps you remain there, unburdened by the need to justify your journey. By releasing the habit of explanation, you release attachment to the past. You step fully into the present, where awareness replaces regret and acceptance replaces defense. In this space, growth becomes natural and peace becomes steady, because your life is no longer shaped by who you were, but guided by who you are now becoming. 6. Stillness creates unbreakable inner authority. Buddhism teaches that true strength is not loud, forceful, or aggressive, but calm, rooted, and deeply still. Inner authority is not something you demand from others, and it is not something you prove through words or explanations. It is something that naturally arises when the mind becomes steady and no longer depends on external validation. When you stop explaining yourself, you begin to experience this inner authority growing quietly within you, shaping the way you move through life without effort or struggle. Most people feel the need to explain themselves because they doubt their own decisions at a deeper level. When the mind is uncertain, it looks outward for confirmation, reassurance, and approval. Conversations replay in the head, imagined arguments are rehearsed, and the mind becomes restless, constantly seeking the right words that will finally make others understand. Buddhism teaches that this mental noise is a sign of imbalance, not because something is wrong with you, but because the mind is scattered across too many external expectations. Stillness begins when you choose not to engage in unnecessary explanation. In that silence, the mind starts to settle, like muddy water that becomes clear when left undisturbed. Thoughts slow down, emotions stabilize, and awareness returns to the present moment. As this stillness deepens, a quiet confidence begins to form, not based on ego or superiority, but on clarity and self-trust. You no longer feel the urge to justify your choices because you understand them clearly within yourself. Buddhism teaches that a person who knows their path does not argue about it. Inner authority does not shout, defend, or convince. It simply exists. When your actions align with your values, your presence carries weight without words. People sense this alignment instinctively. They may not understand your silence, but they feel its strength. This is the power of stillness, the ability to influence without force and to lead without explanation. As you cultivate stillness, you begin to respond rather than react. Situations that once triggered defensiveness no longer disturb your inner balance. Criticism loses its power because your sense of self is no longer built on others' opinions. Praise also loses its grip because your worth is not measured by approval. Buddhism teaches that freedom arises when the mind is no longer pulled back and forth by attraction and aversion. Stillness anchors you in this freedom. Inner authority also brings clarity in decision-making. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop seeking advice from every voice around you. Instead, you listen more deeply to your own awareness. This does not mean ignoring wisdom or guidance, but it means trusting your inner compass first. Buddhism teaches that wisdom arises naturally in a quiet mind, because clarity cannot exist in constant noise. Stillness allows insight to surface without force. Over time, this inner authority becomes unbreakable, not because life becomes easier, but because your mind becomes stronger and more grounded. Challenges are met with presence rather than panic. Uncertainty is held with patience rather than fear. When you know who you are and where you stand, explanations become unnecessary. You do not need to defend your silence, your pace, or your direction. Stillness also protects you from unnecessary conflict. Many arguments are born not from truth, but from the need to be right or understood. Buddhism teaches that peace is more valuable than winning. When you stop explaining yourself, you remove fuel from conflict. You choose calm over chaos and clarity over confusion. This choice strengthens your inner authority because it is guided by wisdom rather than impulse. As inner authority deepens, your relationship with yourself transforms. You become less harsh, less judgmental, and more accepting of your own imperfections. You stop trying to perform for the world and begin living authentically. Buddhism teaches that authenticity is born from awareness, not from approval. When you rest in stillness, you allow yourself to be fully present without masks or defenses. In this state, silence becomes natural rather than forced. You speak when words are necessary and remain quiet when they are not. Your voice carries intention and your silence carries meaning. People may not always understand you, but understanding is no longer your goal. Your goal becomes alignment with truth, and that alignment gives you a strength that cannot be shaken by misunderstanding or judgment. Buddhism teaches that the strongest foundation is built in stillness. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop scattering your energy. You gather it inward, where it transforms into clarity, confidence, and calm authority. From this place, your life begins to move with ease, not because everything is controlled, but because your mind is no longer at war with itself. 7. Your life speaks louder when you say less. Buddhism teaches that truth does not need constant explanation, because truth has a presence that can be felt even when nothing is said. When a person is aligned within themselves, their life begins to communicate on their behalf. Their actions, their calmness, their discipline, and their consistency speak more clearly than any words ever could. Yet many people struggle because they believe they must constantly explain who they are, what they believe, and why they live the way they do. This habit keeps the mind restless and the heart unsettled because it ties self-worth to how well one is understood by others. When you speak less, you begin to listen more, not just to others, but to yourself. You notice your thoughts more clearly, your emotions more honestly, and your intentions more deeply. Buddhism teaches that awareness grows in silence because noise distracts the mind from seeing what is already present. As silence deepens, the need to explain gradually fades because you no longer feel threatened by misunderstanding. You begin to understand that being misunderstood does not diminish your truth, and being judged does not reduce your value. Many people fear silence because they believe it will create distance or confusion. In reality, silence reveals clarity. It exposes which connections are genuine and which ones were built only on conversation, validation, or convenience. Those who truly understand you do not require constant explanation. They sense your sincerity through your behavior, your patience, and your consistency over time. Buddhism teaches that what is real remains steady, while what is false demands constant reinforcement. When you stop explaining yourself, you allow reality to separate what belongs from what does not. Your life becomes lighter when you stop trying to manage how others perceive you. Explaining yourself often turns into an attempt to control narratives, correct assumptions, and repair misunderstandings. This effort consumes energy and creates subtle anxiety because it is impossible to control how every mind interprets your actions. Buddhism reminds us that attachment to reputation is another form of suffering. When your peace depends on how others see you, your mind becomes fragile and easily disturbed. Silence breaks this attachment by shifting your focus inward, where stability exists. As you speak less, your actions begin to carry more meaning. People start to notice patterns rather than promises, consistency rather than claims, and presence rather than performance. Buddhism teaches that karma is shaped by action, not explanation. What you do repeatedly becomes your true statement to the world. When your actions align with your values, there is no need to defend your path, because your life itself becomes the answer. Silence also teaches patience. Many people want to be understood immediately, but understanding takes time. When you stop explaining, you allow time to reveal truth naturally. Those who observe you over time begin to see your intentions without words. They notice how you respond under pressure, how you treat others when no one is watching, and how you remain steady when circumstances change. Buddhism teaches that patience is wisdom because it allows truth to unfold without force. Living with fewer words also strengthens humility. When you stop explaining yourself, you release the need to prove that you are right, good, or worthy. This does not mean you become passive or weak, but that you become secure enough to let go of unnecessary defense. Buddhism teaches that ego thrives on recognition, while wisdom rests quietly within. Silence softens the ego and deepens awareness, allowing you to move through life with grace rather than resistance. There will be moments when your silence is misunderstood. Some people may see it as distance, coldness, or arrogance. Buddhism teaches that this misunderstanding is not something you need to correct. Every person interprets silence through their own inner state. Those who are insecure may feel threatened by it. Those who seek control may feel challenged by it. Those who value depth will recognize it as strength. When you stop explaining, you allow others to reveal themselves through their reactions, which brings clarity without confrontation. As your life speaks more clearly, you begin to trust it more deeply. You stop worrying about whether you are being seen correctly and focus instead on living correctly according to your values. This shift brings peace, because your energy is no longer divided between living and explaining. Buddhism teaches that right action naturally leads to peace, while attachment to outcome creates tension. Silence supports right action by removing unnecessary distractions. Over time, your silence becomes expressive rather than empty. It carries calmness, intention, and presence. When you do speak, your words have weight because they are not wasted. People listen more closely, not because you demand attention, but because your words emerge from stillness rather than reaction. Buddhism teaches that mindful speech arises from a quiet mind, and such speech carries truth without force. When your life becomes the message, you no longer need to convince, persuade, or justify. Your way of being becomes consistent, grounded, and clear. You begin to understand that not everyone needs to understand you, and not everyone is meant to. Buddhism teaches that each person walks their own path, and forcing understanding creates suffering for both sides. Silence allows paths to coexist without conflict. In this way, silence becomes a form of compassion. It prevents unnecessary arguments, protects emotional energy, and honors differences without hostility. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop trying to pull others onto your path and allow them to walk their own. This acceptance brings freedom, because it removes the burden of responsibility for other people's understanding. Eventually, you realize that the deepest communication does not happen through words, but through presence. Your calmness reassures, your steadiness inspires, and your integrity teaches without instruction. Buddhism teaches that the highest teaching is lived, not spoken. When you embody what you believe, your life naturally becomes an example, and no explanation is required. Your life speaks louder when you say less, because silence allows truth to stand on its own. In that silence, peace grows, clarity deepens, and wisdom becomes visible through action. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop scattering your energy, and you begin living with purpose, alignment, and quiet strength. This is the path of inner freedom, where your life itself becomes the teaching, and silence becomes the most honest expression of who you are. 8. Silence teaches you who you really are. Buddhism teaches that most people do not truly know themselves, not because self-knowledge is impossible, but because their minds are constantly filled with noise. This noise comes from opinions, comparisons, expectations, explanations, and the endless need to respond to the world. When you are always explaining yourself, you are always reacting, and when you are always reacting, you are never fully present with who you are beneath the surface. Silence removes these layers one by one and gently forces you to meet yourself without distraction. At first, silence can feel uncomfortable. Without constant conversation or explanation, the mind begins to reveal what it has been avoiding. Old fears, doubts, regrets, and insecurities may rise to the surface. Many people mistake this discomfort as a sign that silence is wrong, when in reality it is a sign that awareness has begun. Buddhism teaches that clarity does not come from avoiding discomfort, but from observing it calmly without judgment. Silence creates the space where this observation becomes possible. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop shaping your identity around how others see you. You are no longer performing a version of yourself that fits expectations, nor are you defending a story that keeps changing depending on the audience. This is when you begin to notice the difference between who you are and who you have been trying to appear as. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises when we mistake the mask for the self. Silence slowly dissolves this confusion by removing the need to maintain appearances. As silence deepens, you begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. You notice which desires come from fear and which arise from genuine intention. You begin to see how often your actions were motivated by the need for approval rather than alignment. This awareness is not meant to judge or punish you, but to liberate you. Buddhism teaches that insight is the beginning of freedom, because once you see clearly, you can no longer be unconsciously controlled by old patterns. In silence, you also begin to recognize how much of your identity was built through comparison. Explaining yourself often involves placing your life next to someone else's, justifying why you are ahead, behind, different, or changing direction. When explanation stops, comparison weakens. You begin to experience your life directly rather than measuring it against others. Buddhism teaches that comparison is a thief of peace because it pulls the mind away from the present moment. Silence brings you back to your own path. Through this quiet presence, you begin to develop a more honest relationship with your emotions. Instead of explaining why you feel a certain way, you allow yourself to feel it fully and observe it without resistance. Anger, sadness, joy, and fear are no longer defended or suppressed, but understood. Buddhism teaches that emotions are not enemies, but temporary visitors. Silence allows them to pass naturally, without being turned into stories or identities. As self-understanding grows, self-compassion follows. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop blaming yourself for not meeting expectations that were never truly yours. You begin to see how much pressure you carried simply to be accepted. Buddhism teaches that compassion begins within, and silence creates the conditions for this compassion to grow. You become gentler with yourself, more patient with your process, and less harsh in self-judgment. Silence also reveals your true values. When words fall away, what remains are actions. You begin to notice what you consistently choose, even when no one is watching. These choices reveal what truly matters to you, far more honestly than any explanation ever could. Buddhism teaches that right action arises naturally when values are clear. Silence removes confusion so that values can emerge without effort. Over time, you may notice that you feel less divided inside. The gap between who you think you should be and who you actually are begins to close. This inner alignment brings peace because you are no longer fighting yourself. Explaining yourself often creates inner conflict because you are constantly adjusting your truth to fit external reactions. Silence allows your truth to remain intact. In silence, you also develop trust in yourself. Without seeking reassurance, you learn to sit with uncertainty and make decisions from awareness rather than fear. Buddhism teaches that trust does not come from knowing all the answers, but from knowing that you can remain present even when answers are unclear. Silence strengthens this trust by teaching you to rely on inner stability rather than external confirmation. As this trust grows, fear loses its grip. Fear thrives in noise, in imagined conversations, and in anticipated judgments. Silence brings you back to what is real in this moment, where fear often has little substance. Buddhism teaches that most suffering is created by the mind projecting into the future or clinging to the past. Silence anchors you in the present, where peace naturally exists. Eventually, silence becomes a mirror. It shows you who you are without distortion, not the version shaped by praise or criticism, but the one that exists beneath all of it. This self-knowledge is not dramatic or overwhelming. It is quiet, steady, and deeply grounding. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is not an escape from life, but a clear seeing of life as it is. Silence supports this seeing. When you know yourself deeply, the need to explain yourself disappears naturally. You no longer fear being misunderstood because your sense of identity is no longer fragile. You no longer rush to defend or justify because there is nothing to protect. Buddhism teaches that the self, when clearly seen, is light and flexible, not rigid or defensive. In this way, silence becomes a teacher. It teaches you patience, honesty, humility, and courage. It teaches you to face yourself without distraction and to accept what you find without resistance. Through silence, you come to understand that you do not need to announce who you are. You simply need to live it. When silence teaches you who you really are, life becomes simpler. Decisions become clearer. Relationships become more authentic. Inner conflict softens. Buddhism teaches that simplicity is a sign of wisdom because clarity naturally removes excess. Silence creates this simplicity by stripping away what is unnecessary. Ultimately, silence reconnects you with your true nature, which is calm, aware, and complete without explanation. In this state, you no longer seek permission to exist as you are. You move through life quietly, confidently, and with deep presence. This is not withdrawal from the world, but full participation without attachment. Buddhism teaches that when the mind is quiet, truth reveals itself effortlessly. By stopping the habit of explanation and embracing silence, you allow this truth to emerge. You come to know yourself not through stories, but through direct experience. And in that knowing, peace becomes natural, steady, and unshakable. 9. Silence frees you from the need to control how you are seen. Buddhism teaches that one of the deepest sources of suffering is the illusion of control, especially the belief that we can control how others perceive us. Many people spend their lives subtly trying to manage impressions, correct misunderstandings, explain intentions, and protect their image. This constant effort keeps the mind restless because it is built on something unstable. No matter how carefully you explain yourself, every person hears you through their own conditioning, memories, expectations, and emotional wounds. Silence is the moment you step out of this exhausting struggle and accept a powerful truth that Buddhism has taught for centuries, which is that you cannot control how you are seen, and you do not need to. When you feel the urge to explain yourself, it often comes from fear. Fear of being judged unfairly, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being seen as weak, wrong, or unworthy. Buddhism teaches that fear arises when the mind clings to identity. The more tightly you cling to how you want to be perceived, the more vulnerable you become to suffering, because perception is never fully in your hands. Silence loosens this grip. It allows you to stop fighting invisible battles inside other people's minds. As you begin to practice silence, you may notice discomfort arise. The mind may say that if you do not explain, people will assume the worst. Buddhism teaches that assumptions will happen regardless of your explanations. Even silence is interpreted, but the difference is that silence does not drain you. When you explain, you become emotionally invested in the outcome. When you remain silent, you remain centered within yourself, allowing others' interpretations to exist without becoming your burden. Trying to control how you are seen keeps you trapped in constant self-monitoring. You replay conversations in your head, wonder if you said too much or too little, and imagine how others might be talking about you. This mental activity steals presence from the current moment. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when the mind lives everywhere, except where the body is. Silence brings the mind back home. It frees you from rehearsing, defending, and repairing narratives that you were never meant to carry. When you stop explaining yourself, you begin to notice a shift in your energy. You feel lighter, not because everyone suddenly understands you, but because you no longer need them to. Your sense of identity stops depending on approval. Buddhism teaches that identity built on others' opinions is fragile, while identity rooted in awareness is stable. Silence strengthens this stability by teaching you to stand without leaning. There is great freedom in allowing yourself to be misunderstood. This does not mean accepting injustice or remaining silent when harm is being done, but it means releasing the need to correct every false assumption. Buddhism teaches wise discernment, knowing when speech is necessary and when it is driven by ego. Many explanations are not acts of truth, but acts of self-protection. Silence reveals this difference and helps you choose wisely. As silence deepens, you begin to see how much of your life was shaped by image maintenance. You may realize that certain choices were made not because they were aligned with your values, but because they looked acceptable to others. Buddhism teaches that awareness brings liberation. When you see clearly how much energy was spent trying to be seen a certain way, you naturally let go of that habit. Silence supports this letting go by removing the need to perform. Freedom from controlling perception also transforms relationships. When you stop explaining yourself, relationships become more honest. Those who care about you learn to know you through your actions rather than your words. Those who depended on your explanations to maintain control may feel uncomfortable because silence removes their leverage. Buddhism teaches that discomfort often arises when attachment is challenged. Silence gently challenges attachment without confrontation. You may notice that fewer people have opinions about your life when you stop explaining it. This is not because they suddenly care less, but because you have stopped feeding the cycle. Buddhism teaches that what you do not fuel cannot grow. By refusing to constantly explain, you allow unnecessary drama to dissolve on its own. This creates space for peace to enter naturally. Over time, silence teaches humility. You accept that you are not meant to be fully known by everyone. Buddhism teaches that each person sees only a fragment of reality. Expecting universal understanding is unrealistic and creates suffering. Silence helps you accept this truth without bitterness. You stop demanding that the world see you clearly and start seeing yourself clearly instead. As this acceptance grows, your actions become more authentic. You no longer shape your behavior to avoid misunderstanding. You act according to your values, knowing that some people will interpret you correctly and others will not. Buddhism teaches that right action is more important than right image. Silence allows right action to stand without being wrapped in explanation. There is also courage in silence. It takes strength to let go of the need to be liked, praised, or approved of. Buddhism teaches that courage is not loud, it is quiet and steady. Silence reflects this courage by showing that you trust your path enough not to defend it constantly. You trust time, consistency, and integrity to reveal what words cannot. When you free yourself from controlling how you are seen, you reclaim enormous mental energy. That energy returns to your life as focus, patience, and calm. You sleep better. You think more clearly. You become less reactive. Buddhism teaches that peace is not created by changing the world, but by changing your relationship with it. Silence changes this relationship at a fundamental level. Eventually, silence becomes natural rather than intentional. You no longer withhold words as a strategy. You simply do not feel the need to speak unless speech serves a purpose. Your words become fewer but more meaningful. When you do speak, it is from clarity rather than defense. Buddhism teaches that right speech arises from right awareness, and silence prepares the ground for this awareness. As your life unfolds, people will still form opinions. Some will admire you, some will misunderstand you, some will project their fears onto you. Buddhism teaches that this is the nature of the human mind. Silence allows all of this to exist without disturbing your peace. You learn that you do not need to carry other people's perceptions on your shoulders. In the end, silence frees you because it removes an impossible task from your life, which is the task of managing how you are seen. When you stop explaining yourself, you step out of illusion and into reality. You accept that you are responsible for your actions, not for others' interpretations. This acceptance brings a deep, steady peace that does not depend on circumstances. Buddhism teaches that liberation begins when attachment ends. Attachment to image is one of the hardest to release because it feels like safety. Silence shows you that true safety does not come from being understood, but from being aligned. When you live in alignment with your values, your life becomes simple, honest, and free. In this freedom, you move through the world quietly, without fear of misunderstanding and without the need for explanation. Your presence becomes steady, your actions become clear, and your peace becomes independent. Silence does not make you invisible, it makes you unshakable. 10. Silence allows life to align without force. Buddhism teaches that much of human suffering comes from forcing life to unfold according to our expectations, rather than allowing it to move in its natural rhythm. When you constantly explain yourself, justify your choices, or defend your direction, You are often trying to control outcomes, reactions, and timing. This effort creates inner tension because life does not respond well to force. Silence becomes the doorway through which alignment enters, because silence removes resistance and allows things to fall into place naturally. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop pushing against reality. You no longer try to convince others that your path is right, necessary, or meaningful. Instead, you begin to walk it quietly, trusting that what is true does not need to be argued for. Buddhism teaches that right effort is not about doing more, but about removing what is unnecessary. Silence removes unnecessary struggle by allowing life to respond to action rather than words. Many people confuse control with security. They believe that if they explain enough, plan enough, or justify enough, they can prevent misunderstanding, failure, or loss. Buddhism teaches that this belief creates suffering because it places faith in illusion rather than awareness. Silence gently dissolves this illusion by teaching you to remain present without needing guarantees. In this presence, fear slowly loses its grip because fear thrives on imagined outcomes rather than lived experience. As silence deepens, you begin to notice subtle shifts in how life responds to you. Without constant explanation, your actions become cleaner and more focused. You act not to prove, but to align. You move not to impress, but to live truthfully. Buddhism teaches that alignment attracts harmony naturally, just as a calm lake reflects the sky clearly. When your inner state is calm, life reflects that calmness back to you in unexpected ways. Silence also teaches patience, which is one of the most powerful virtues in Buddhism. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop rushing understanding. You allow time to do its work. Time reveals intentions, clarifies misunderstandings, and places people where they truly belong. Buddhism teaches that forcing clarity creates confusion, while allowing clarity creates peace. Silence honors this wisdom by trusting the unfolding process. When you are no longer trying to manage reactions, you begin to notice how many things resolve themselves without intervention. People who misunderstand may eventually understand, and those who never do slowly fade from relevance. Situations that once felt urgent lose their emotional charge. Buddhism teaches that impermanence applies not only to pain, but also to confusion. Silence allows impermanence to do its work without interference. Alignment through silence also changes how you make decisions. Instead of reacting emotionally to external pressure, you listen inwardly. You give yourself time to feel whether a choice is aligned or forced. Buddhism teaches that wisdom arises when the mind is quiet enough to hear insight. Silence creates this quiet space where intuition becomes clearer and choices become more honest. As you stop explaining yourself, you also stop defending outcomes. You no longer feel responsible for how things turn out in other people's minds. You focus instead on acting with integrity and letting consequences unfold naturally. Buddhism teaches that attachment to outcome is a root of suffering. Silence loosens this attachment by shifting attention from results to right action. There is also deep relief in no longer carrying the burden of persuasion. Explaining yourself often turns into subtle persuasion, trying to make others agree, accept, or approve. Silence releases you from this burden. You allow people to disagree without feeling threatened. You allow misunderstanding without feeling diminished. Buddhism teaches that inner peace grows when the need to control fades. When life aligns without force, relationships also change. Some connections deepen because they are no longer built on constant explanation. Others dissolve because they were sustained only by emotional labor. Buddhism teaches that not all relationships are meant to last forever. Silence allows relationships to find their natural place without conflict or blame. You may notice that your life begins to feel simpler. Decisions feel less heavy. Conversations feel less draining. Your days feel less crowded mentally. Buddhism teaches that simplicity is not achieved by adding more, but by removing excess. Silence removes excess effort, excess worry, and excess self-defense. What remains is clarity. Alignment also brings trust. You begin to trust yourself, life, and timing more deeply. You stop asking for signs and start noticing patterns. You stop seeking reassurance and start recognizing inner stability. Buddhism teaches that trust is not blind belief, but quiet confidence built through awareness. Silence nurtures this confidence by grounding you in the present. As silence becomes a way of being rather than a practice, you experience fewer inner conflicts. You are no longer divided between who you are and who you are trying to explain yourself to be. This inner unity brings peace because energy is no longer split. Buddhism teaches that wholeness arises when the mind stops arguing with itself. Silence ends this argument. When life aligns without force, effort becomes effortless. You still work, act, and move forward, but without tension. You are no longer pushing against resistance that was created by explanation and expectation. Buddhism teaches that flow arises when effort and awareness are balanced. Silence restores this balance by calming the mind. Eventually, you realize that silence was never about withdrawal. It was about trust. Trust that truth does not need defense. Trust that right action speaks clearly over time. Trust that life responds to presence more than persuasion. Buddhism teaches that liberation comes not from controlling life, but from understanding it deeply. Silence is one of the clearest expressions of this understanding. When you stop explaining yourself, life begins to cooperate instead of resist. Situations unfold with less friction, people respond with less drama. You move through challenges with steadiness rather than urgency. Buddhism teaches that harmony arises when the mind is no longer forcing outcomes. Silence allows harmony to emerge naturally. In this state of alignment, peace becomes stable, not because nothing goes wrong, but because your relationship with what goes wrong has changed. You respond instead of react. You act instead of defend. You trust instead of control. Silence supports all of this by keeping the mind clear and the heart steady. Ultimately, silence allows life to align without force because it removes the illusion that force was ever necessary. You discover that what is meant to stay remains, what is meant to go leaves, and what is meant to grow unfolds in its own time. Buddhism teaches that acceptance is not resignation, but wisdom. Silence embodies this wisdom fully. When you live this way, explanations fall away naturally. You no longer feel the urge to convince the world of your truth. You simply live it. And in that living, life aligns quietly, steadily, and deeply, without struggle or noise. 11. Silence dissolves the ego without destroying the self. Buddhism teaches that much of human suffering comes from ego, not because the self exists, but because we become overly attached to the image of who we think we are and how we believe we should be seen. Ego is not loud pride alone. It is also insecurity, defensiveness, comparison, and the constant urge to explain, justify, or protect an identity. When you feel the need to explain yourself, it is often the ego quietly asking to be acknowledged, validated, or defended. Silence gently dissolves this ego without harming the deeper self, allowing awareness to replace attachment. The ego thrives on reaction. It needs something to push against, someone to convince, or an image to maintain. When you explain yourself, the ego feels active and necessary, because it believes that without explanation it will be misunderstood or diminished. Buddhism teaches that this fear is an illusion. The true self does not require explanation because it is not dependent on perception. Silence exposes this truth slowly and safely, without confrontation or force. As you stop explaining yourself, you may notice discomfort arise because the ego feels ignored. It may urge you to speak, defend, or clarify. Buddhism teaches that this discomfort is not a sign of loss, but a sign of loosening attachment. When you sit with this discomfort instead of reacting to it, awareness grows stronger. You begin to see the difference between the voice that wants to be right and the awareness that simply observes what is happening. Silence allows you to witness ego rather than act from it. You start to notice when the urge to speak comes from fear of judgment, fear of being overlooked, or fear of losing control. By not immediately responding, you create space between impulse and action. Buddhism teaches that this space is where freedom lives. In this space, you realize that you do not have to obey every urge to explain yourself. Over time, silence softens the ego's grip. You no longer feel threatened by misunderstanding. You no longer rush to correct every false assumption. This does not mean you stop caring, but that you stop over-identifying with how you are perceived. Buddhism teaches that ego dissolves naturally when it is not constantly fed. Silence starves ego of unnecessary fuel while nourishing awareness. As ego loosens, humility grows. Humility in Buddhism is not self-denial, but accurate self-seeing. You begin to see yourself neither as superior nor inferior, but simply as a human being moving through life with intention and imperfection. Explaining yourself often involves placing yourself at the center of attention, even subtly. Silence shifts attention away from self-image and toward presence. This shift brings emotional balance. When ego is active, emotions fluctuate rapidly based on approval or disapproval. When ego quiets, emotions settle. You still feel joy, sadness, and concern, but they do not control you. Buddhism teaches that equanimity arises when the mind is no longer pulled by attraction and aversion. Silence supports this equanimity by reducing ego-driven reactions. Silence also reveals the difference between self-respect and ego protection. Ego protection seeks to defend an image. Self-respect seeks alignment with values. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop defending appearances and start honoring integrity. Buddhism teaches that integrity does not need explanation. It is expressed through consistent action over time. As ego dissolves, compassion expands. You become less judgmental toward others because you no longer feel the need to compete for understanding or recognition. You begin to see that others explain themselves for the same reason you once did, fear of being unseen or misunderstood. Buddhism teaches that understanding this shared human struggle opens the door to compassion. Silence allows this compassion to arise naturally. You may also notice that silence brings a sense of inner spaciousness. Without constant self-reference, the mind feels lighter. Thoughts pass without attachment. Conversations feel less personal and more grounded. Buddhism teaches that spaciousness of mind is a sign of wisdom because it allows experience to arise and pass without clinging. As ego fades, authenticity strengthens. You no longer perform versions of yourself for different situations. You act from clarity rather than strategy. Explaining yourself often leads to subtle manipulation of perception. Silence removes the need for such manipulation. Buddhism teaches that authenticity is a natural state when ego is not dominating behavior. This does not mean you never speak or clarify. Buddhism emphasizes right speech, which arises from wisdom rather than ego. Silence trains you to recognize when speech serves truth and when it serves self-image. When you do speak from this place, your words are calm, precise, and necessary. they do not seek validation, and therefore they carry more weight. Silence also strengthens inner stability. When ego is quiet, your sense of self is no longer shaken by praise or criticism. You stop oscillating between pride and shame. Buddhism teaches that stability arises when the mind rests in awareness rather than identity. Silence helps the mind return to this resting place. As this stability grows, fear decreases. Fear is often the ego anticipating loss of control or status. Silence shows you that nothing essential is lost when ego steps aside. In fact, you gain peace, clarity, and freedom. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not the ego winning, but the ego relaxing. Eventually, you realize that silence has not erased you. It has revealed you. The self that remains is quieter, steadier, and more compassionate. This self does not need to announce itself or defend itself. It moves through life with humility and confidence, aware of its place in the larger flow of existence. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is not becoming something new, but letting go of what obscures what is already present. Ego is one of those obscurations. Silence gently removes it without violence or rejection. You do not fight ego, you simply stop feeding it. In this way, silence dissolves ego without destroying the self. What remains is awareness, integrity, and calm presence. You live without the burden of constant explanation. You act without fear of misunderstanding. You exist without attachment to image. This is not emptiness, but fullness without noise. When ego dissolves, life feels lighter. Relationships become simpler, decisions become clearer, peace becomes steady. Buddhism teaches that this peace is not dependent on silence itself, but on what silence reveals. By stopping the habit of explanation, you allow truth to stand without interference. In this state, you no longer feel the need to prove who you are. You simply live it. And in that living, the self becomes free, not through effort, but through understanding. Silence becomes the path, not because it hides you, but because it reveals what was always there. 12. Silence becomes your final form of freedom. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not something you gain by adding more to your life, but something you uncover by removing what was never necessary. One of the heaviest burdens most people carry without realizing it is the burden of explanation. The need to explain who you are, why you act a certain way, why you changed, why you chose a different path, or why you no longer fit into old expectations, slowly becomes a form of emotional imprisonment. Silence, when understood deeply, is not withdrawal from life, but the final release from this invisible cage. For most of their lives, people are conditioned to believe that explanation equals safety. They are taught that if they communicate clearly enough, defend themselves convincingly enough, or justify their intentions honestly enough, they will avoid conflict, rejection, or misunderstanding. Buddhism teaches that this belief is rooted in fear rather than wisdom. Misunderstanding is part of human interaction, not a failure of communication. Silence frees you when you stop trying to escape something that cannot be avoided. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop negotiating your existence with the world. You no longer ask for permission to be who you are becoming. This does not happen suddenly or dramatically. It unfolds slowly, as the mind learns that nothing essential is lost when explanations fall away. Buddhism teaches that clinging is the root of suffering, and clinging to being understood is one of the most exhausting attachments. Silence loosens this grip gently, without force. As silence deepens, you begin to experience a different relationship with fear. Fear no longer shouts as loudly because it is no longer fed by imagined conversations and future judgments. Many fears are maintained by mental rehearsals of explanation, where the mind prepares defenses for situations that may never happen. Silence interrupts this cycle. It returns the mind to the present moment, where fear often has no solid ground. Buddhism teaches that presence dissolves fear more effectively than resistance ever could. In this presence, you begin to feel free, not because life becomes predictable, but because you stop needing it to be. Silence teaches you to trust uncertainty. You realize that you can remain calm even when others do not understand you, even when outcomes are unclear, and even when your path looks unfamiliar to those around you. Buddhism teaches that trust is not certainty, but confidence in your ability to remain aware within uncertainty. Silence cultivates this confidence. Freedom through silence also transforms how you relate to your past. You no longer feel obligated to explain old mistakes, outdated beliefs, or former versions of yourself. Buddhism teaches impermanence, reminding us that identity is not fixed. Silence allows impermanence to be accepted rather than defended against. You stop dragging the past into the present through explanation and allow it to rest where it belongs. This release brings lightness because you are no longer carrying identities that no longer serve you. As this freedom grows, your relationship with others changes in subtle but profound ways. Conversations become simpler. You listen more deeply. You speak more intentionally. Buddhism teaches that right speech is rooted in awareness, not obligation. Silence trains you to recognize when speech arises from wisdom and when it arises from fear. Over time, you naturally choose fewer words, but each word carries more truth. Some people may feel uncomfortable with your silence. They may interpret it as distance, indifference, or mystery. Buddhism teaches that others' reactions are reflections of their inner world, not a verdict on your character. Silence frees you from managing these reactions. You stop explaining your silence, just as you stop explaining your life. In doing so, you reclaim energy that was once spent on self-defense. This reclaimed energy begins to nourish your inner life. Your mind becomes clearer, your emotions become steadier, your awareness becomes sharper. Buddhism teaches that when the mind is not scattered by unnecessary effort, wisdom arises naturally. Silence creates the conditions for this wisdom to emerge without force. Freedom through silence also reveals how little control you ever truly had over perception. This realization is not discouraging, but liberating. You accept that each person lives inside their own interpretation of reality. Buddhism teaches that suffering decreases when we stop trying to control what is uncontrollable. Silence embodies this teaching by releasing the need to manage how you are seen. As you let go of this control, you become more authentic. You act from alignment rather than strategy. You choose what feels right rather than what looks right. Buddhism teaches that authenticity is not a performance, but a state of being that emerges when fear is no longer guiding behavior. Silence removes fear's influence gradually and gently. There is also deep peace in no longer carrying the responsibility of being understood. You realize that understanding is not something you can demand or force. It arises naturally in some relationships and never arises in others. Buddhism teaches acceptance not as resignation, but as wisdom. Silence practices this acceptance daily, allowing life to unfold without constant interference. As silence becomes your natural state, you begin to experience a different kind of confidence. It is not the confidence that seeks recognition, but the confidence that rests in self-trust. You know who you are without needing to say it. You know where you stand without needing agreement. Buddhism teaches that this inner stability is the foundation of true freedom. Freedom through silence also brings clarity about what truly matters. Without the noise of explanation, priorities become visible. You notice where your energy flows naturally and where it feels forced. Buddhism teaches that clarity arises when desire and awareness are aligned. Silence helps align them by removing distractions. In this clarity, you begin to live more intentionally. You say no without guilt. You say yes without overthinking. You allow distance without resentment. Buddhism teaches that intentional living reduces suffering because it removes inner conflict. Silence supports this by quieting the mental arguments that once accompanied every decision. As your life simplifies, your presence deepens. You become more fully here, more attentive, more grounded. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is not found elsewhere, but in direct experience of the present moment. Silence anchors you in this experience by reducing unnecessary mental movement. Eventually, silence no longer feels like a practice. It becomes a natural expression of freedom. You are silent not because you are hiding, but because there is nothing left to defend. You are quiet not because you are afraid, but because you are at peace. Buddhism teaches that peace is not achieved through effort, but revealed through letting go. Silence is one of the most powerful ways of letting go. In this state, life feels spacious. Problems arise and pass. Joy comes and goes. Relationships change. Through it all, your inner state remains steady. Buddhism teaches that equanimity is the mark of wisdom, and silence nurtures this equanimity by keeping the mind clear. When silence becomes your final form of freedom, you no longer measure your life by how well it is explained, but by how honestly it is lived. You stop asking whether you are being understood and start asking whether you are being true. This shift changes everything, because truth requires courage, but explanation requires endless effort. Freedom through silence does not make you isolated, it makes you independent. You connect with others from wholeness rather than need. You speak when words serve love or clarity, and you remain silent when silence serves peace. Buddhism teaches that wisdom knows the difference. In the end, silence frees you because it returns you to yourself. Not the self shaped by expectation or fear, but the self grounded in awareness and compassion. This self does not need to be explained. It does not need to be defended. It simply exists, present and complete. This is the deepest teaching of silence in Buddhism. When you stop explaining yourself, you do not disappear, you arrive. 13. Silence allows you to walk your path without carrying others. Buddhism teaches that every being must walk their own path, yet much of human suffering comes from trying to carry others along with us, explain ourselves to them, or adjust our direction so that they feel comfortable. When you constantly explain yourself, you are often trying to bring people with you mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, even when they are not ready or not meant to walk where you are going. Silence frees you from this invisible responsibility and allows you to move forward without dragging the weight of other people's expectations, fears, and misunderstandings. From a young age, many people are conditioned to believe that love means inclusion, explanation, and constant reassurance. They learn to feel guilty when they grow in ways that others do not understand. Buddhism teaches that compassion does not mean self-betrayal. You can care deeply for others without slowing your own growth or shrinking your truth to remain acceptable. Silence becomes an act of wisdom here, because it allows you to continue your journey without constantly pausing to justify why you are changing. When you explain yourself repeatedly, you are often attempting to resolve other people's discomfort. Someone may feel threatened by your growth, confused by your silence, or unsettled by your independence. In response, the mind tries to smooth the tension by explaining, softening, or apologizing for simply being who you are becoming. Buddhism teaches that this habit creates suffering because it places responsibility for others' emotional states on your shoulders. Silence gently removes this burden by reminding you that each person is responsible for their own understanding. As you practice silence, you begin to notice how often explanation was driven by guilt rather than clarity. You may realize that you explained yourself not because you wanted to, but because you feared being misunderstood, rejected, or left behind. Buddhism teaches that fear thrives when we confuse attachment with responsibility. Silence separates the two. You learn that attachment pulls you backward, while responsibility asks you only to live with integrity. Walking your path without carrying others does not mean abandoning them. It means trusting that they have their own path to walk, at their own pace, in their own way. Buddhism teaches impermanence and non-attachment, reminding us that relationships change as people grow. Silence allows these changes to happen naturally, without forcing alignment where it no longer exists. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop trying to synchronize journeys that were never meant to be identical. This freedom brings emotional relief. You no longer feel the constant tension of trying to be understood by everyone you care about. You stop adjusting your truth to make it easier for others to accept. Buddhism teaches that inner peace arises when there is no contradiction between what you feel and how you live. Silence removes this contradiction by allowing your actions to speak without commentary. As you walk your path quietly, you also become more respectful of others' journeys. You stop trying to convince them of your perspective or pull them toward your understanding. Buddhism teaches that wisdom cannot be forced. It unfolds when conditions are right. Silence honors this truth by allowing others to remain where they are without judgment or pressure. This respect creates healthier boundaries and deeper compassion. There is also strength in learning to walk alone when necessary. Buddhism does not teach isolation, but it does teach independence of mind. Some parts of your journey will not be understood, shared, or supported by others. Explaining yourself in these moments often leads to disappointment because you are seeking validation from places that cannot provide it. Silence teaches you to draw strength from within, where stability exists regardless of external response. As you continue walking without explanation, you begin to trust your direction more deeply. You stop looking over your shoulder to see who agrees with you. You stop waiting for approval before taking the next step. Buddhism teaches that trust in oneself grows when actions align with awareness. Silence supports this alignment by removing the noise of opinion. Over time, you may notice that some people drift away. This can feel painful at first, but Buddhism teaches that clinging to what is no longer aligned creates suffering. Silence allows separation to occur without conflict, blame, or resentment. It creates space for relationships to end gently and for new ones to arise naturally, based on who you are now rather than who you were. Walking your path without carrying others also frees you from comparison. When you explain yourself, you often compare your progress, values, or choices to those around you in order to justify them. Silence removes the need for comparison by affirming that different paths do not need to be ranked. Buddhism teaches that comparison is rooted in ego and fear. Silence dissolves both by returning attention to your own steps. This way of living also deepens humility. You stop assuming that others should understand your path or follow it. You recognize that your truth is personal, not universal. Buddhism teaches that humility arises from awareness of interdependence and difference. Silence reflects this humility by allowing diversity of experience without conflict. As your journey continues, you may experience moments of loneliness. Buddhism teaches that loneliness is not the same as solitude. Solitude is chosen and nourishing, while loneliness arises from resistance. Silence transforms loneliness into solitude by helping you accept moments of aloneness without fear. In this solitude, clarity and insight often emerge. Walking your path quietly also refines your intentions. Without the need to explain yourself, you act more honestly. You choose actions that feel right rather than those that look acceptable. Buddhism teaches that intention shapes karma. Silence supports right intention by removing performative behavior. Eventually, you begin to feel lighter, not because life becomes simple, but because you are no longer carrying emotional weight that was never yours. You stop carrying others' confusion, disappointment, or resistance. Buddhism teaches that freedom arises when we stop carrying what we cannot control. Silence embodies this freedom fully. In this freedom, you walk with steadiness. Your steps become confident, not because you are certain of every outcome, but because you are aligned with awareness. Silence gives you the courage to continue, even when the path is unclear. Buddhism teaches that the path reveals itself step by step, not all at once. As you walk without explanation, you may find that some people eventually understand you without words. Others may never do so. Buddhism teaches acceptance of both. Understanding is not the goal. Alignment is. Silence keeps you aligned by preventing unnecessary detours into justification and defense. In the end, silence allows you to walk your path without carrying others because it returns responsibility to where it belongs. You are responsible for living truthfully. Others are responsible for interpreting that truth in their own way. Buddhism teaches that when responsibility is placed correctly, suffering decreases. This is one of the deepest freedoms silence offers. You move forward without guilt. You grow without apology. You change without explanation. You walk your path with calm presence, trusting that those who are meant to walk with you will recognize your direction without needing words. Silence does not separate you from life. It separates you from unnecessary burdens. In that separation, you discover how light and free the journey can be when you finally walk it as your own. 14. Silence teaches you to live without seeking permission. Buddhism teaches that one of the most hidden forms of bondage is the belief that we need permission to live truthfully. Many people do not realize how deeply this belief shapes their lives. They wait for approval before changing, reassurance before acting, and agreement before committing to a direction. Explaining yourself becomes a subtle way of asking the world for permission to exist as you are becoming. Silence breaks this habit gently but completely, teaching you how to live without seeking approval from anyone outside yourself. From an early age, most people are conditioned to explain their actions so they will not be misunderstood, corrected, or rejected. Over time, this conditioning turns into an inner voice that constantly asks whether something is acceptable, reasonable, or approved. Buddhism teaches that this voice is not wisdom, but fear disguised as caution. Silence allows you to hear this voice clearly and recognize it without obeying it. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop asking others to validate your choices. This does not mean acting recklessly or without compassion, but acting from awareness rather than permission. Buddhism teaches that right action arises from understanding, not consensus. Silence creates space for this understanding to guide you instead of external opinions. At first, living without explanation can feel unsettling. The mind may worry about how others will react, what they will assume, or whether they will judge. Buddhism teaches that discomfort often appears when old attachments loosen. This discomfort is not a sign that silence is wrong, but that a deeper freedom is emerging. By remaining silent through this discomfort, you allow the need for permission to dissolve naturally. As silence becomes part of your life, you begin to notice how often explanation was actually self-doubt. You may realize that you were not explaining to help others understand, but to reassure yourself that your choices were valid. Buddhism teaches that confidence grows when self-trust replaces self-doubt. Silence nurtures this trust by removing the habit of external confirmation. Living without seeking permission also transforms your relationship with authority. You stop measuring your life against others' expectations of success, morality, or progress. Buddhism teaches that each person's path unfolds according to their karma and awareness. Silence allows you to respect this uniqueness without comparison. You no longer feel obligated to justify why your life looks different from someone else's. This freedom does not make you indifferent to others. Instead, it makes your compassion clearer. When you stop seeking permission, you stop expecting it from others as well. You allow people to live as they choose, without needing to understand or approve of their path. Buddhism teaches that true compassion does not control, persuade, or pressure. Silence embodies this compassion by allowing difference without resistance. As you live without explanation, your decisions become simpler. You stop overthinking whether you are allowed to change, rest, leave, grow, or begin again. Buddhism teaches that impermanence is natural, and resistance to change creates suffering. Silence helps you accept impermanence by removing the need to justify it. You change because awareness calls for it, not because permission is granted. There is also dignity in living without explanation. You stop presenting arguments for your worth. You stop defending your boundaries. You stop apologizing for your presence. Buddhism teaches that dignity arises when the mind is free from fear. Silence restores this dignity by removing the need to prove anything. As this dignity strengthens, you begin to act with quiet confidence. Your actions are not rushed, defensive, or reactive. They come from clarity. Buddhism teaches that clarity arises when the mind is not divided between desire and fear. Silence unifies the mind by quieting fear's voice. Living without seeking permission also frees you from unnecessary guilt. Many people feel guilty for choosing differently, growing apart, or stepping away from roles that no longer fit. Buddhism teaches that guilt often arises from attachment to others' expectations rather than wrongdoing. Silence helps you recognize this difference. You learn to distinguish between ethical responsibility and emotional obligation. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop inviting others to evaluate your life. This evaluation often leads to doubt, confusion, or delay. Buddhism teaches that wisdom is internal, not voted on. Silence protects wisdom by allowing it to mature without interference. As you continue living this way, you may notice that fewer people question your choices. This is not because they suddenly agree, but because you no longer present your life as something open for discussion. Buddhism teaches that boundaries arise naturally when self-respect is present. Silence establishes these boundaries without confrontation. Living without permission also deepens your relationship with solitude. You become comfortable standing alone in your decisions without feeling isolated. Buddhism teaches that solitude can be nourishing when it is chosen rather than resisted. Silence transforms aloneness into inner companionship, where awareness becomes your guide. There will be moments when your silence is misunderstood. Some may see it as stubbornness or distance. Buddhism teaches that misunderstanding is inevitable and temporary. Silence allows you to remain steady through it, trusting that truth reveals itself through consistency rather than explanation. As you grow into this freedom, your life begins to feel lighter. You act without constant mental debate. You move forward without hesitation. You rest without guilt. Buddhism teaches that ease arises when effort is aligned with awareness. Silence supports this alignment by removing unnecessary resistance. Eventually, living without seeking permission becomes natural. You no longer ask yourself whether you are allowed to live truthfully. You simply do. This does not make you reckless or careless. It makes you honest. Buddhism teaches that honesty is the foundation of peace. In this state, your silence is not empty. It is full of intention, clarity, and presence. You speak when words are useful and remain silent when silence serves peace. Buddhism teaches that wisdom knows when to act and when to refrain. Silence sharpens this knowing. When silence teaches you to live without seeking permission, you discover a deep freedom that cannot be given or taken away. You no longer live to be approved. You live to be aligned. You no longer ask whether you are allowed to be who you are. You realize that you always were. This is one of the most profound teachings of Buddhism. Liberation does not come from being understood, accepted, or permitted. It comes from seeing clearly and living accordingly. Silence reveals this truth not through words, but through experience. In this experience, you walk your life with calm authority. You make choices without apology. You change without explanation. You exist without justification. Silence does not isolate you from the world. It frees you within it. This is the quiet power of silence. It teaches you that you were never meant to ask permission to be awake. Sharpens. Silence teaches you to let life unfold without resistance. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not created by life itself, but by our resistance to how life unfolds. Much of this resistance appears quietly in the habit of explaining ourselves. When you explain, you are often trying to correct reality, manage outcomes, or reduce uncertainty. You want life to make sense, to appear reasonable, to follow a path that others can understand and accept. Silence gently removes this resistance and teaches you how to let life unfold as it is, not as you wish it to be. From an early age, people learn to explain in order to stay safe. They explain their mistakes to avoid punishment, their intentions to avoid misunderstanding, and their choices to avoid rejection. Over time, this habit grows into a belief that life must always be clarified, justified, or defended. Buddhism teaches that this belief creates tension because life is not meant to be constantly interpreted. Some experiences are meant to be lived, not explained. Silence allows you to experience life directly without placing it inside mental frameworks that limit understanding. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop interfering with the natural movement of events. You allow situations to evolve without rushing them toward comfort or clarity. This does not mean becoming passive or careless, but becoming present and receptive. Buddhism teaches that wisdom arises when effort and acceptance are balanced. Silence restores this balance by removing the urge to force resolution through words. Resistance often hides behind explanation. You may explain because you want reassurance, because you want others to agree, or because you want uncertainty to disappear. Buddhism teaches that uncertainty is not a problem to be solved, but a condition of existence to be understood. Silence teaches you to sit with uncertainty without anxiety. It shows you that not knowing does not mean danger, and not being understood does not mean failure. As silence deepens, you begin to notice how often life resolves itself when you stop interfering. Misunderstandings soften with time. Tension fades when it is not fed. Situations shift when they are given space. Buddhism teaches impermanence, reminding us that nothing stays fixed, not confusion, not pain, not misunderstanding. Silence honors impermanence by allowing change to occur naturally rather than trying to control its timing. Letting life unfold without resistance also transforms your relationship with disappointment. When you explain yourself, you often carry expectations about how others should respond. When those expectations are not met, disappointment arises. Silence releases expectation by removing the need for a specific response. Buddhism teaches that freedom arises when desire loosens its grip. Silence loosens desire not by suppressing it, but by redirecting attention to presence. As you stop resisting life, you stop fighting moments that feel uncomfortable or unclear. You allow emotions to arise and pass without turning them into stories. Buddhism teaches that emotions are temporary experiences, not definitions of self. Silence prevents emotions from becoming entangled with identity by allowing them to move freely through awareness. This practice also changes how you experience time. When you explain yourself, you often live ahead of the moment, anticipating reactions and consequences. Silence brings you back into the present. Buddhism teaches that the present moment is the only place where peace can be found. Silence anchors you here by quieting mental projections. Letting life unfold without resistance also deepens trust. You begin to trust that clarity will come when it is ready, not when it is demanded. You trust that people will find their own understanding, or not, and that both outcomes are acceptable. Buddhism teaches that trust is not blind faith, but confidence in the nature of change. Silence nurtures this confidence by removing the illusion that constant effort is required to keep life stable. As resistance dissolves, your actions become more fluid. You respond to situations rather than reacting against them. You choose when to speak and when to remain silent based on awareness rather than anxiety. Buddhism teaches that right action arises naturally when the mind is clear. Silence clears the mind by reducing unnecessary struggle. There is also gentleness in letting life unfold. You become softer with yourself, allowing mistakes without harsh judgment and growth without pressure. Buddhism teaches that compassion begins with acceptance. Silence allows acceptance to take root by removing the need to defend or explain imperfections. Letting go of resistance does not mean giving up direction. It means moving forward without inner conflict. You still have intentions, goals, and values, but you no longer fight reality when it does not align perfectly with them. Buddhism teaches that suffering decreases when effort is guided by awareness rather than attachment. Silence keeps effort aligned. As this way of living matures, you begin to notice a quiet joy. This joy does not come from success or approval, but from ease. You feel less tense, less hurried, and less burdened by the need to manage outcomes. Buddhism teaches that joy arises naturally when the mind is at peace. Silence supports this peace by removing resistance at its root. Letting life unfold also changes how you experience control. You recognize that control was never absolute, and releasing it does not create chaos. Instead, it creates flow. Buddhism teaches that clinging to control creates suffering, while releasing it creates freedom. Silence embodies this release fully. In relationships, letting life unfold without resistance allows deeper authenticity. You stop trying to steer conversations or outcomes. You allow others to be as they are without correcting or persuading. Buddhism teaches that freedom must be mutual to be real. Silence respects this mutuality by allowing each person to walk their own way. As you continue practicing silence, you may find that life feels less heavy. Challenges still arise, but they are met with steadiness rather than tension. Buddhism teaches that equanimity is the ability to remain balanced amid change. Silence cultivates equanimity by keeping the mind open rather than defensive. Eventually, letting life unfold without resistance becomes natural. You no longer struggle against what is happening. You participate fully without clinging. You act when action is needed and rest when rest is appropriate. Buddhism teaches that harmony arises when awareness guides effort. Silence strengthens this guidance. In this state, explanations fall away because they are no longer needed. You do not resist misunderstanding, delay, or uncertainty. You allow them to exist and change in their own time. Buddhism teaches that acceptance is not surrender, but clarity. Silence expresses this clarity without words. When silence teaches you to let life unfold without resistance, you discover a profound freedom. You are no longer at war with reality, you move with it. You live without forcing meaning onto every experience. You trust the process of becoming. This is one of the deepest lessons silence offers. Life does not need to be controlled to be meaningful. It needs to be met with awareness. When you stop explaining yourself and stop resisting what unfolds, life reveals its rhythm naturally, calmly, and truthfully. In this rhythm, peace becomes steady, not because everything is understood, but because nothing is being fought. Silence teaches you this peace by guiding you back to presence, where life is always unfolding exactly as it should. In the end, silence is not something you practice. It is something you return to. It is not an escape from life, but a return to life as it truly is, without distortion, without defense, and without the exhausting need to be understood. Throughout these teachings, one truth becomes clear again and again, which is that the more you explain yourself, the further you move away from inner freedom, and the more you trust silence, the closer you come to peace. Buddhism teaches that suffering is born when we cling, and one of the most deeply rooted clings is the desire to be seen correctly, understood fully, and approved consistently. This desire keeps the mind restless and the heart unsettled because it places your peace in the hands of others. Silence gently takes that power back. It returns peace to where it belongs, within your own awareness. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop living in reaction. You stop shaping your life around other people's expectations, fears, and misunderstandings. You stop carrying emotional weight that was never yours to hold. In this release, something subtle but profound happens. Your life begins to feel lighter. Not because problems disappear, but because you are no longer fighting reality or negotiating your truth. Silence teaches you patience, not the kind that waits anxiously, but the kind that trusts timing. It teaches you confidence, not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that does not need recognition. It teaches you compassion, not only for others, but for yourself, because you stop punishing yourself for not fitting into every expectation placed upon you. As explanations fall away, presence grows stronger. You become more aware of your thoughts without being controlled by them. You feel emotions without being overwhelmed by them. You make choices without apology and move forward without fear of misunderstanding. This is not withdrawal from the world, it is full participation without attachment. Some people will understand you less as you grow quieter. Others will understand you more deeply without a single word being spoken. Buddhism teaches acceptance of both. Understanding was never meant to be universal. Alignment was always the goal. Silence keeps you aligned by preventing unnecessary detours into justification, defense, and self-doubt. In silence, your life becomes the message. Your actions replace your explanations. Your consistency replaces your promises. Your peace replaces your arguments. Those who are meant to walk with you will recognize your direction without needing instructions. Those who are not will slowly fade, not out of rejection, but out of natural separation. Silence does not make you invisible, it makes you grounded. It does not make you weak. It makes you unshakable. It does not take your voice away. It teaches you when your voice truly matters. When you stop explaining yourself, you are not hiding. You are honoring what is sacred within you. You are allowing your growth to happen without interference. You are letting life unfold without resistance. You are trusting that truth does not need to be defended to exist. This is the quiet wisdom Buddhism points toward. Not a life filled with noise and validation, but a life rooted in awareness, presence, and inner freedom. Silence becomes your refuge, not because the world is loud, but because your mind no longer needs to be. Build yourself quietly. Reveal nothing that does not serve peace. Walk your path without apology. Let your life speak in its own time. And in that silence, discover the freedom that was never missing, only waiting to be claimed.